Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be back, sort of, remotely once again, at the University of Copenhagen. My name is Javier Cha. I taught a Zoom course on digital Korean studies in the fall semester of 2020. And I'm back here again to talk about big data to you. So some of you look familiar. Some of you are new, and the campus looks very, very familiar, but I've never physically stepped foot in Copenhagen. Hopefully, this summer, I'll be able to finally visit Denmark and not only meet some of you in person, but also do some of my research related to big data in the Nordic region. The Nordic region is a focus area in my research lab, and I've been meaning to visit the area for some time. So my name is Javier Cha. Today's talk is titled Big Data and the Future of the Korean Humanities. So why big data and the humanities? And let me briefly introduce myself as a way of explaining why I have big data and humanities in one same title. I'm an associate professor of East Asian Studies. So I have a degree in East Asian Studies. That's my background in the College of Liberal Studies at Seoul National University. College of Liberal Studies means that we admit close to about 150 students every year, all of whom will choose to major in two different types of disciplines. And so I have students in communication, political science, international relations, electrical engineering, artificial intelligence, a wide range of disciplines represented. And in this program, I teach, occasionally I teach Korean history, but more frequently I teach an interdisciplinary paradigm called digital humanities. I'm also the principal investigator of my research lab called the Big Data Studies Lab. And Barbara asked me to briefly describe my background. So I have my bachelor's and master's degrees in Asian studies. So at the bachelor level, I studied broadly on Asia, the whole continent of Asia, in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia, with a focus on East Asia, but I also took many courses on Southeast Asia and South Asia as well. In my master's program, I wrote a thesis on the intellectual history of 18th century literary criticism. So that was my master's thesis research interest. And I don't know if you received the link to the YouTube lecture, which I more or less retired now. So a lot of the contents from that YouTube lecture, I don't talk about anymore in my public lecture anywhere anymore. So if you take a look at the YouTube lecture that Barbara may have sent you, if not, I can send you the link later. I talk about my experience writing my master's thesis on the 18th century and how the introduction of databases has challenged my previous assumptions and previous approaches to that type of research. So that's the connection there. And in my PhD program, I went to Harvard to become a specialist on Korea. The reason being that I worked on 18th century literary criticism, and the writings constantly make references to Korea and very early Joseon literary critics. So in order to understand the 18th century, I figured I need to understand what happened in Korea, because as it turns out, Joseon specialists know very little about Korea. And once you know Korea a lot, once you understand Korea really well, Joseon dynasty looks very, very different. So I ended up specializing in the intellectual history of Korea. And in the process, I did 3 fields, one on pre-modern Korean history, one on middle period Chinese history, and one on book history with a focus on early modern Europe. And before coming to pursuing my graduate degrees in Asian studies, I was an amateur programmer. So I was interested in programming. I really enjoyed studying the IT industry, and I still do. And when I moved on to the humanities, I thought that, IT programming, these things are something that I put behind me. But in 2008, I signed up for a course, a graduate seminar on digital humanities offered by my China side advisor, Peter Bo. So those of you who are familiar with digital humanity, the field of digital humanities may have heard of the project, a very famous project called China Biographical Database, and also China Historical GIS. He's the director of both projects. So he introduced me to this field that allows me to combine my interests in computing and also East Asian studies. So I've been a practitioner of digital humanities since 2008. And as I moved along with my career through getting my PhD and then doing a postdoc and getting more and more experience in this digital humanities discipline, I developed a new approach to digital humanities, which I will briefly discuss today, called big data studies. And in a nutshell, you can think of big data studies. What I mean by this is a book historian and a medievalist looking ahead to the year 2100. Basically, from the perspective of the year 2100, how would a historian try to figure out what happened in the early 21st century, in the 2010s and 2020s? Because the source materials that define our society today is fundamentally born digital, and they exist in the form of what we call, in popular usage, called big data. So I will explain what I mean by big data and what I mean by big data studies very briefly today in this kind of a sneak preview version of my big data studies lab with a focus on Korean topics. Okay. That was, sorry, my introduction was very long, but so today's very brief lecture, I can go back to a question I received when I taught the Digital Korean Studies course in Copenhagen about 1.5 years ago. And this question I received several times from several of you. And the question is, where are the archives of K-pop communities and fan sites? Right? And this is a very tricky question. And my initial answer was, I really don't know. Right? There's no officially curated digital archive of K-pop communities and fan sites. Right? But I can tell you this, there is a nonprofit based in San Francisco called the Internet Archive. You may have heard of it. Right? So once in a while, when you go on the web and you look for something controversial or something very outdated, it's no longer there. The web page is gone because the author found it too controversial, took it down, right? Or the server is so old, the server went offline, it's no longer there. But once in a while, if you do a query on something called the Wayback Machine, a service offered on the Internet Archive, you can find remnants of web pages that are no longer live. Right? So if you do some keyword searches on this service called the Wayback Machine, for example, 서태지 and the Boys, 서태지와 아이들. So those of you who are avid K-pop fans would know who 서태지, the 서태지 group is, right? Very famous boy group from the late 1990s. So if you want to find fan pages, you can find some. So I don't know who decided to save them, who decided to submit the request to have them make a copy of these websites. So you can, it's not perfect, but you get some sense of what some of these web pages may have looked like. So this is a 서태지 fan page, fan website created roughly 22 years ago, right? So 2000, so September 2000. And it says, if you read Korean, it says, 제가 한 달 동안 만든 저의 최고의 홈페이지입니다. So in the last month, the past month, this is the best homepage I've ever created, right? He put in a lot of effort to make this homepage, right? It looks kind of silly by today's standards, right? But this was seen as very nice and fancy, and he was very pleased with the outcome. And we know something about this, the creator, right? His name is Chang Jong-woo, high school student, age 17. And here you see some interesting bits about this website, because you see the color scheme that was really popular, design was popular in the early 2000s. And here you have a plugin that is no longer in operation. This is probably a flash animation that is no longer visible. A lot of images haven't been saved, but some of these small icons have been saved, so you can look at them, right? And you see a rough skeleton, rough sketch of what the website may have looked like. But of course, as the internet age evolved, things have become much more complicated. We don't create web pages in static HTML files anymore. We upload a lot of our content. BTS fans, for example, use Twitter very actively, right? Or Instagram stories, Instagram posts, or create YouTube videos and upload them on YouTube, or create TikTok content to express their fandom, right? And the total amount of data that has accumulated in the past 15 years or so of this Web 2.0 paradigm is astronomical. Just to give you one indicator, the total amount of video that has been uploaded on YouTube, if you were to play it back in 1x, amounts to about 100,000 years of video. So the question becomes, will this survive into the future so that future historians can know something about us using YouTube, right? Will this YouTube culture will it be possible to study it? Or will Google be around for another 100 years or 200 years and provide an archive for us of past YouTube content? And if we do have an archive of YouTube, will it be possible to study 100,000 years of video? And of course, the amount of content that is being uploaded on YouTube is only growing exponentially every year. Right? There have been some attempts. For example, Twitter, the Library of Congress made an attempt to archive Twitter, and it failed. I can go on with the details of. I will skip the details as to why it failed. I can just tell you that the Library of Congress, with the amount of resources they have, the amount of the number of very skillful archivists and librarians, they failed to make an archive of Twitter. So it's a very difficult task to make an archive of Web 2.0 big data content. And the reason for that is many. I will just talk about a couple of points. And the first point has to do with the transition we made as early as the 1990s. And it's a transition that is still ongoing, right? But increasingly, our society has become more and more reliant on digital media rather than print. This transition from print to digital media. So just to give an example, the way I traditionally do my Korean history research, this is an extant copy of an encyclopedia from 1493. In Chinese, it's called Shu and Leiju. In Korean, it's called Samun Yuchi. The most popular encyclopedia during the reign of King Seongjong. Right? There were officials who were just going nuts to get a hold of one copy of this encyclopedia during Seongjong reign. There's a very interesting account in the Seongjong Shillok that talks about this. More than 500 years old, printed using movable metal type, and it's still with us today. It's in very good condition. You open it up, you can feel it, you can touch it, you can just open it up and read it. The Harvard Yenching Library even allows you to take it out and bring it to class because they trust the durability of this medium. What about today's digital media? When we just look at it on first glance, it looks like it's more durable than paper. But when you think about when you look into the technical aspects of how information is stored and how information is preserved and retained in medium like this, is much, much more fragile than paper, right? So this is the most common way of storing digital information today. It's called a solid state drive. So those of you who have a notebook computer, you all have SSD, M2 NAND SSD chips in your notebook computer. The average lifespan of data stored in SSDs is about 7 years, right? So so digital media fundamentally reversed our relationship with source materials, our primary source materials. In the case of paper-based books, right, once you print this book, if it's high quality book, books are very likely to last centuries. digital media lasts only if you intentionally make an archive using devices that are designed to retain digital content for a very long time. In most cases, most digital media do not retain data for more than 7 to 30 years. But if you use specialized media, for example, a millennial disc, which has a special coating, looks just like a Blu-ray disc, but if you use this millennial disc with special coating, it guarantees the retention of data in this device for up to 1,000 years. Or cutting-edge long-term preservation digital technology called Project Silica, on using femtosecond laser inscribes bits on this silica glass, and it's been in experimental projects being used by Hollywood film archives and studios these days. But eventually we're going to start storing digital cultural heritage that humanities scholars will use in the future. And some of these data are being stored in vaults like this for example, in Norway, in Svalbard, Norway. There is an abandoned coal mine where discs like this are being buried for long-term preservation. So in the very distant future, hopefully, if any digital content that scholars want to use in the future gets lost, they can dig it up and study them. Okay. But there's more to it than this, right? So this transition from print to digital, but also the advent of big data has fundamentally challenged our assumptions in classical definitions of what we call digital humanities. So those of you who took my digital humanities class are familiar with this. So in digital humanities, in most cases, we convert source materials that originally existed in print and turn them into digital form, turn them into databases, and then apply computational methods on them, or apply new database technology on them to engage in scholarly inquiry in a novel way, right? But in the case of big data, and in the case of classical digital humanities approaches, even source materials that look extremely large, for example, 500 years worth of record from the Joseon dynasty, the Joseon Longterm in digital form amounts to only 815 megabytes of XML. The Hanguk Munip Chongan, the collected works of 1,259 pre-modern writers, is only 560 megabytes of text file. It's easy to fit them in your notebook computer. In fact, my notebook computer already more or less contains the entire set of databases that we have extant that are relevant for the research of the Goryeo dynasty, right? So digital humanities looks very cutting edge, but at the end of the day, we're engaging in materials that are very small by today's big data standards, right? So what is being challenged when we say big data? With big data studies, the next paradigm in digital humanities, we're gonna start not only dealing with data of very large size. So one example I gave you is 100,000 years of YouTube, right? You don't have to study the entire 100,000 year video collection, right? But you need to query it. You need to identify the material that you need out of that very large database. How do you do that? You have to learn how to use algorithms, right? Not only that, from the perspective of materiality of it, how does big data exist? Big data, by its dictionary definition, means data of a very large size. This is the Oxford English Dictionary definition. So large that it begins to pose significant logistical challenges. This is a very loaded definition. It will take maybe an hour just to unpack everything that is going on here, but I'll just explain it with a picture. Big data exists in networked form. It is so large that it requires racks of hardware. It looks like it exists in the form of infrastructure, right? In a digital rendition of it. It looks kind of like this, right? Stacks and stacks of servers, right? That manages data of astronomical size that is beyond our comprehension as everyday users, right? So in the case of today's contemporary South Korea, here's one great example. Naver's flagship data center called KAK is located in just outside of Chuncheon in northeast of Seoul, right? As of 2014, at the time when it was built, it had 120,000 servers, and it looks like this capacity may have either doubled or tripled, right? At the time when it was built, the Naver claimed that it manages more information than 10,000 national libraries of Korea combined. And now the latest slogan is maybe 20,000, right? So this is, so future scholars of Korea, contemporary Korea, will have to deal with maybe an archival version of this, or maybe a remnant of this, right? Or at the least, we need to learn something about how a piece of infrastructure like this operates, okay? And in the process, we learn some very interesting things like, and this is what I mean by this paradigm shift and this new assumption. The assumptions are being challenged, right? Because previously when we work on materiality of some sources and things like this, we don't think about issues like energy. But when you're dealing with big data, right? You're dealing with infrastructure like this, and in order to power 120,000 plus servers, you require massive amounts of electricity, right? And this is, things get really interesting. I can just go on with this topic alone, but let me just give you one example to illustrate what I mean by this. There is a new facility being built in Pyeongchang at the old MBC studio that used to broadcast the Pyeongchang Olympics. That site is being repurposed to house the new National Library of Korea's Data Preservation Center. It will go into operation in 2024. It looks very fancy, and this is a computer-generated rendition of it, right? A data preservation archive will go into this. Why do I bring this up? It's because librarians have already gone through this epistemic shift. One of the first things that librarians realized roughly 10 years ago, and this is a story I was told, was that they wanted to create a very nice digital library in the Seoul location, right? The National Library of Korea, I think it's Seoul, right? And they realized that they had to scrap the project initially, because when they first started this project, they never thought to think about electricity. The National Library of Korea, when they went digital, the specialists, the hardware specialist, the facility specialist told them, okay, so how are you going to power all those servers? So right away, they had to secure funds for about $500,000 US to install a substation. Right? This is really serious, right? So when you have digital information of this kind of size, this kind of scale, electricity begins to matter. These are all kind of issues that we need to bring into consideration as we deal with big data in Korean studies. It's not something that is irrelevant to us just because we're in the humanities. One last point, how do you browse through 100,000 years of YouTube video content? You have to engage with this research paradigm developed by Lev Manovich called cultural analytics. Initially back in 2004, it was used to do experimental work with digital scans of European painters or Instagram photos and such. But nowadays, you can use this paradigm to use machine learning, especially computer vision, to do basic classification and basic searches through video content with the aid of algorithms. So this is an example of a paper published in KAIST that does basic Bechdel test on video content and object detection test using most widely very widely used commercial computer vision APIs. So very simple APIs that you can just call using Python or any API calling method of your preference, and you can go through very large collections of video. So these are the kind of work that we need to start engaging in. because of the nature of the kind of content that we're dealing with. So that's the end of my very short introduction to big data and the Korean humanities.